Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information, you can check out our website for the Public Affairs Forum at www.austinuu.org. Today's speaker is Dr. Rebecca Bell-Metereau, and her topic is How to End Embarrassments at the Texas State Board of Education. She will now be introduced by Bonnie Gardner.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our forum. The actions of the Texas State Board of Education have been an embarrassment to the state. Even worse, the State Board of Education is undermining the quality of education provided for our children. They have approved and promoted textbooks which dismiss established science and which promote religiously driven accounts of human history and our nation's history. They've also promoted textbooks which distort the history of the Mexican Americans of the Southwest and which suggests that a quest for full citizenship and exercise of civil rights were inappropriate disruptions of an established social order. They have substituted religious and political ideology as truths and enshrined them in some of the textbooks for children. So a question would be, how can the children of Texas compete in a global economy with textbooks like these? Today, I'm honored and very happy to have Dr. Rebecca Bell-Metereau speaking. She's a professor of English and director of the Media Studies minor program at Texas State University. She's received numerous awards for teaching excellence. Early on in her career, she taught in the Peace Corps and then served as an interpreter for U.S. Air Force relief flights in Chad. She's been a Fulbright scholar and a teacher in Senegal, in West Africa. In San Marcos, where she lives, she has been very civically involved and served as Planning and Zoning Commissioner, Solid Waste and Blue Ribbon Bond Commissioner, and has been very involved in environmental issues. And we want to give her a very warm welcome. You're going to be fascinated, I think, by what she has to say. Dr. Rebecca Bell-Metereau.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start this discussion with sort of bragging about myself, but also with great humility here. I got an award and was interviewed by our university newspaper for a little column they were going to do. And somebody said, well, why do you teach? And I said, I teach to save the world. And it was one of the many things that I said, but it ended up being the headline for this particular little article. And my husband never lets me forget that. He made a great deal of fun of that. But I actually believe it. I think that education really is what we need in order to save not just ourselves here in Texas, but the United States and the entire world. Again, the next slide there. So what do I mean by I teach to save the world? I think that if people know the facts, if they know what's happening, that most people will make the wise decision. Not everybody, but most people will figure out what is in their own self-interest and what is in the interest of other people, because we rely on each other so much. A lot of people aren't aware of what the State Board of Education does, or even that it exists. They call it the school board, which is, of course, your local school board, and they kind of think of it as just something to do with education, but they don't really know what. In Texas, the State Board of Education has an outsized influence. So I want to give you a little bit of background about what it is before we talk about what the problems are. The State Board of Education in Texas is one of the very influential boards because of our population. And I'd like to talk about the recent history, and then I'll end by saying what citizens can do about the future curriculum and textbook choices. Those aren't the only important choices that the State Board of Education makes, but they're two of the biggest because they involve a lot of money. And y'all familiar with the expression cui bono? Who benefits, who gets something from it? It usually means money. That has a lot to do with education here in Texas and, of course, all around the nation. And so we'll be talking a little bit about some of the side issues that are influenced by money. So next slide. So what is the SBOE in Texas? And what are the qualifications to serve? You would think that to be on a board that has this much influence, that you would have to know something about education. But in fact, all you need to do to be a member of this 15-member elected body, there are 15 districts, you need to be over 26 years old, you need to be a U.S. citizen, and you need to be registered to vote. That's it. If you meet those qualifications, you may run for State Board of Education, and you'll go through the primary system. And if you're a Democrat or Republican, you may have opponents, but whoever wins the majority of that group then goes on to the election, and that occurs in November, just like all of our major elections do. Now, the board members are elected in staggered 4-year terms. So each 10 years they do redistricting and they stagger the terms again. It's citizens who run for office, and it's party affiliated. That's been one of the problems with the board because it has turned into something very political. But it didn't just start in recent years. I want to mention, and I'm going to repeat this at the end, that the election is November 8th. And when people wonder, what can we do about this? Vote. So I'll mention that at the end. Yeah. In fact, it's kind of the answer to what can we do about anything. You know, anything we want to do something about, vote. If you're not ready to, get out there and run for office, which is a considerably more complicated process, at least you can vote. So, you can educate yourself on what the issues are and make your voice heard. This map shows you the 15 districts. As you can see, some of them cover a whole lot of counties. I think there are 254 counties in Texas, and a lot of them just cover a lot of empty space. And then you can see the kind of congested ones around in the center, around the big cities, of course, Houston and Dallas and Austin. And you can also see that some of these districts, if you'll look here, you'll see there's some really, long, skinny districts. There's another one here that's kind of long and skinny. Those are gerrymandered to make sure that people are put together in the district that will either be Republican or Democrat. And then in the areas where there's some competition, computers can figure out exactly what configuration will give one side or the other some benefit. So it's carved out that way, and that is a problem because if you're running for this office, my district, District 5, where we live here, some of you are in District 5, some of you are in District 10, but it splits Austin in half. And then the district goes either up to the north in District 10 or down to the south in District 5. So people who are running for office have to do a lot of traveling sometimes, especially if you look at that little green one right there in the middle, that one there. You have to go all the way down to the border, and it starts up in Bexar County there and then goes all the way down to the border. So that would be a lot of territory to cover if you wanted to go and meet all of your constituents or even try to meet a few of them. The responsibilities include deciding the curriculum, and that means what you teach kids. Curriculum is figuring out what you're going to teach them at each grade level and, what level of detail you're going to go into for various concepts and information. And then choosing texts for almost 1 in 10 public school children. It's right between 1 in 10 and 1 in 11 school children go to school in Texas. The only bigger market is in California. And California has a very different approach. In Texas, it's very much politicized, and so the textbooks tend to carry some political weight as they're being selected. The board oversees the Texas Education Agency, and they're the ones that figure out all of the details and make sure that all the schools have the information, that they go over all of the curriculum and everything that goes through the Texas Education Agency. And then the TEA director is appointed by the governor. The State Board of Education also is responsible to oversee, it varies depending on the market, but right now it's about a $23 billion permanent school fund, which pays for education. They advise on teacher certification requirements. So, if you're ever wondering how do you get to be a teacher, the people who kind of make that decision are going to be people on that State Board of Education. A lot of other people handle the details of how that's enacted, but then it's the board that approves that. And they approve and revoke open enrollment charter schools. And that's an important function. We hover around about 130 or so charter schools, depending on what happens. Some charter schools fold because they can't get their finances together, and then there's a limit to the number of charters, and so then people apply for more charters, and there's always a discussion about should we raise the number of charters. They also adopt the ethics rules. That is, what is ethical in how you conduct public education or other education, and they determine how teachers get certified. They set the big goals for Texas public schools, and they look at issues of instruction, how schools are paid for, and initiatives. Now, one of the biggest initiatives that happened in Texas came about as a result of No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind came in with President Bush, and it was a well-meaning decision to try to make sure that all children would receive an education, they would all achieve a certain level of accomplishment. That's a little bit easier said than done, especially because education and the achievements that students make correlate very closely to the socioeconomic level of the school district. The people in the school district tend to fit very closely with the level of performance of the students. This isn't true completely across the board, but it's the strongest correlation that we have. And it kind of makes sense, because if you have the money to hire good teachers and have good facilities, and you have parents who have the time and leisure to be able to go and get involved in their students' education, all of those are things that can help education. This, I want to go to the next slide here. This is the current set of people who are up for office in the state of Texas. There are 7 districts that are electing people. In District 1, you see Martha Dominguez, a Democrat, and she's the incumbent, and she's not running. The 2 people who are running are Georgina Perez and Hugo Navala Jr. So a Democrat and a Green Party candidate. So you can see in El Paso, it's a largely Democratic district. In District 2, 3, and 4, which is Brownsville, San Antonio, it's that long, skinny district I pointed out to you. That one won't be up until 2 years from now. And then in Houston. So there are 3 Democrats in that area. Then in District 5, there are 3 candidates. Ken Mercer, who is the incumbent, this is his 4th term to be on the board. Rebecca Bell-Metereau, that name is familiar, but we won't go into that. And Ricardo Perkins, who is a libertarian. In Houston, District 6, this is an important race, even though we're not going to be voting on that one. The people in District 6 will be voting on it. Donna Bahorich is the Republican incumbent chair. She was appointed by the governor, and she is running against R. Dakota Carter. I think I made a typo there. Whitney Beaulieu, Libertarian, and Laura Palmer, Green candidate. Now, the reason District 6 is important is that Donna Bahorich, who is the chair, is someone who has declared as her passion homeschooling, which is fine, but the board is primarily responsible for public education. So there's a little bit of a misfit there with her qualifications and what she cares about. So this is something that it's an interesting race to look at, and we'll see, how that goes. Next slide. And then David Beaumont David Bradley in Beaumont is the incumbent, and he is not up for election. The next batch here, District 8 from the Woodlands, Barbara Cargill is Republican, and she's the incumbent, and she's running unopposed. So she'll be there in the next round. District 9. Now this is one that's caused a lot of controversy. Have any of you heard of a woman named Mary Lou Bruner? Anybody heard about her? Well, she ran as a Republican in District 9. Some people call District 9 from outer space. But really, there are a lot of very intelligent, reasonable people there. And they were sharp enough to discover that Mary Lou Bruner was not always totally accurate in the things that she said. She has a very active website where she claimed that President Obama was a gay prostitute, and he used the income from that to purchase drugs for his drug habit. I think we could all safely say that that's probably not true. And she had a number of other theories, and so she was running for the board, and she had education background. She was a kindergarten teacher, retired. Now, where she got into trouble, though, she would be replacing Tom Ratliff, who is the vice chair, and he has been a very strong proponent of public education, a very reasonable, even-handed vice chair, and he's been a very good influence on the board in terms of what teachers want. And he has a family that has a background in serving public education. So when Mary Lou Bruner ran in the primaries, she made the mistake of saying that she knew all of these members of the Board of Education, the local boards, and that she had talked to them. And unfortunately, she was talking to a group that had these very people she was saying she knew and had talked to in the audience. And they stood up and said, "I've never met you before in my life, let alone endorse you," because she was saying that she had their support and she had met them. And so she kind of fumbled around a little bit. But somebody was there with a camera, and they had it on YouTube. And so even the people who weren't at the meeting, it became very famous. And Mary Lou Bruner, because of her outrageous statements, was even invited for a while. I think the invitation may have been withdrawn, to the Texas Tribune Festival. And other people were not invited, but she made enough of a splash by her outrageous statements. So she lost her chance to be on the board, but she did have her 15 or 20 minutes of fame there for a while. So the other candidates there who are running, Amanda Rudolph, a Democrat, Kevin Ellis, Republican, and Anastasia Wilford, a Libertarian. So people will have a choice there. In District 10, this is the northern part of Austin, and it goes up north quite a ways. Two people, Tom Maynard, who is the Republican incumbent, and Judy Jennings, a Democrat, are running. And their philosophies are somewhat different. There's more interest in public education. The candidate, Judy Jennings, is more of a supporter of public education, less a supporter of vouchers. So in these others, 11, 12, 13, and 14 and 15, people are running unopposed in 14 and 15. And in District 11, there are just single candidates. So that's not going to be very competitive. So let's look at the history of education in Texas. Next, please. In 1838, President Mirabeau B. Lamar, the Republic of Texas, advocated setting aside public domain for public schools. So it was very important to early Texans. And it was one of the things that they objected to, that they were demanding that there be attention to public schools. And he decided that we had to have support for public education, and he is called the father of education in Texas. In 1845, the Texas State Constitution advocated public education, instructing the legislature to designate at least 10% of the tax revenue for schools. This was delayed until Governor Elisha Pease on January 31st, 1854, signed the bill setting up the Texas public school system. Now, that was the beginning, but there's kind of an interesting story with what happened later on. So this SBOE with the staggered terms, it's an unpaid position, but a lot of people care about it. And there's been a lot of wrangling that's gone on over this board. They meet currently five times a year, and make all of these decisions. But Texas was, at the time of the development of education, was sort of progressive in a way. Annie Webb Blanton was appointed the first state superintendent of Texas schools. And there's an interesting story about why she was appointed. In Texas, women had the right to vote in the primary before women had the right to vote in the United States at large. So at the time, Governor William P. Hobby said to Annie Webb Blanton, "You have a lot of suffragists, women who can vote. If you will support me and get those women out to vote for me in the primary, I will appoint you superintendent of schools," because he knew that she cared about education. And so that's what happened, because he knew at that time Texas was a very democratic state. I mean, people were all Democrats practically. And so if he won the primary, he knew then he would win the election. And so that's what she did. She delivered those voters for him, and he then delivered her the appointment as the first state superintendent of Texas schools. So, next slide. So here she is, Annie Webb Blanton, a very intelligent and dedicated woman who believed in public education, and she had a lot of influence on public schools, advancing the interests of public schools. Now, sort of flash forward to what happened. There are a lot of changes over how the board was configured, how many members they were, and in recent years they've settled on 15 members. At one time I think they had 24 members, so it's changed over the years. But in the 1960s, something interesting happened with a couple called Gabler, Melvin Gabler and Norma Gabler. And some of you may have heard of these two people. They really shook up things at the State Board of Education because they studied all of the textbooks and they determined that there were errors in these textbooks. And they found a number of factual errors. For example, in one it said that Napoleon won in Waterloo. And I think most people know that's not quite right. So, they found some of these errors that were actual real errors. But they also recognized what they saw as a bias. They thought the textbooks were anti-family and anti-Christian. So they scoured through every single detail to see if there was something that was portrayed in an inaccurate way that influenced the portrayal of families and the family structure or Christianity. And so Melvin and Norma believed that the man was the head of the household. So if they detected something that went against that idea, they were quick to point it out. If they found anything that they thought was insulting to the Christian religion, they would point that out. And if they found anything that they thought was flattering in any way to any other religion, they would point that out, especially if they could find some little error in the facts. That made it so that publishers responded. Publishers did not want to go through the time and hassle of having these people come to these meetings and read their long lists of everything that they wanted to have changed. So it got so the publishers would send them drafts and say, hey, you want to look this over? You see anything you don't like? We'll just take it out. And they got them to take out, quite a few things that might have been able to be passed, but they were really the chief editors of textbooks for a while there. They did some changes on those textbooks that, for example, illustrations. At one time, they had an illustration of a woman carrying a briefcase. They didn't like that, and so they changed it to a woman carrying a cake, I think. So they thought that would, they claimed that somehow this briefcase business was not accurate. And, I don't know if they personally were responsible for that change, but that's the kind of changes that were made. I don't want to be sued. Actually, they're both deceased, but maybe their family or someone would decide to sue over this inaccuracy because they were very good at pointing out inaccuracies. So that happened somehow, but it's an example of the textbooks changing according to what the board wanted them to change. Next, in the 1990s, want to move on? Yeah. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I haven't told you to change for several times now. Go ahead and change again. Okay, these were the challenges. Now in the 1990s. Next. All right, so Will Davis became the chair of SBOE during the 1990s, and he was noted for working really well across the aisle. A lot of people point to the 1990s as kind of the golden era of education. And this was a time when people worked across the aisle. He had an elementary school named after him. Next. Recent controversies kind of started. The former TEA head, Robert Scott, did not like high-stakes testing, and he was arguing against them. He quit. I say he was fired, but he quit. And I think under some pressure, but he was really trying to get a strong curriculum of social studies, science, sex education, and math. These were things that he had children in the school system, and he wanted them to get a good education from that school system. Next. Michael Williams then was the next TEA director. And he had appointed Lizette Reynolds, who was the deputy commissioner's second in command. Reynolds fired a TEA veteran, Chris Comer, for emailing information about a talk criticizing intelligent design. You all know what intelligent design is? It's the idea that counters the theory of evolution. He was a supporter of charter schools, choice, and vouchers. And he was also, I think somewhat ironically, against affirmative action. As you can see, he is African American, and he did not like anything that smacked of affirmative action, of trying to improve the balance of racial groups in school or employment. Next. We now have Mike Morath, who is a businessman, and he is the new TEA director appointed by Governor Abbott. And the best of Big D online describes him as, Mike Morath is on a mission from God. That's their headline. I don't know if he really is on a mission from God. I haven't spoken to God about it. But I did speak to Mr. Morath, actually. I went to a Texas Tribune program. They always have programs with different figures. And so I was able to get in the very last question of the day. And I said, you know, Texas ranks dead last in pre-K education because we have no limit on the student-teacher ratio. The classes can be as big as they want to stuff them in there. And he said, well, that study is very, that assessment is very inaccurate, and that the data shows that there's no correlation between class size and teacher effectiveness or student learning. And I thought, boy, there speaks a guy who's never been a teacher. I've volunteered in public schools and I've taught, and I know class size makes a big difference, especially with the littler ones. But he calls himself data informed, and Best of Big D also says that he was the seed crystal for the controversial Home Rule initiative, where you would let various schools and districts decide how they were going to teach education, and they were not going to have any standards that came down from the top. So I would say that he's a very bright person who is on a mission. And the mission is not necessarily in keeping with what teachers or teachers' unions think constitutes a good educational environment. In social studies, in 2014, we had the famous examples of getting rid of Thomas Jefferson as an Enlightenment thinker. We also had such important founding fathers as John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who was a Lutheran minister. That was one of the names that students were expected to memorize. They also wanted to explain how Moses informed America's founding documents. And Ken Mercer said that, quote, Moses was not a founding father. However, I believe he did influence our founding fathers. So that's one of the many controversial things about the latest social studies revisions until in 2015, SBOE reviewed changes, and Houghton Mifflin Harcourt withdrew their U.S. government textbook at the last minute, saying the book was intended for a, quote, national program and did not meet all the Texas standards. In other words, they said, we're not going to write a book just for Texas. We want to teach the history all of the United States as accurately as we can. The Fordham Institute, which is a conservative think tank, said, quote, black codes, the Ku Klux Klan, or sharecropping, the term Jim Crow never appears, and racial segregation is only mentioned in a passing reference to the 1948 integration of the armed forces. So that's how racial issues are dealt with. In social studies, McCarthyism, students were required to know about, quote, McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee, the findings of which were confirmed by the Venona Papers. So the Venona Papers justify McCarthyism as a good method for rooting out un-American activities. In the science curriculum, evolution standards have become acceptable, but climate science is still an issue. And if you look out at the weather that's going on all around the world, you can see that it's probably the major problem that our young people are going to face. Oh, we got to go. I'm sorry. Change the slides, please. We got to catch up here. Social studies, on to the next. 2015, on to the next. Fordham Institute, on to the next. Social studies, on to the next. Science. All right, we have caught up. Now next. In economics, the standards, this is an example of their questions. Compare and contrast free enterprise, socialist, and communist economies in various contemporary societies, including the benefits of the U.S. free enterprise system, and explain why a free enterprise system of economics developed in the new nation, including minimal government intrusion, taxation, and property rights. I put sick there for thus, because it's very confusing the way it's worded. But as you can see, the students are asked to not explain economics in terms of the benefits and problems of different systems. It's always that whatever the United States is doing, there are just benefits to it, and then everybody else has it wrong. So finally, the Mexican-American Heritage Textbook. Anybody heard of this? Change the slide, please. The board failed to approve an elective course in Mexican-American Studies, and so the text Mexican-American Heritage was under consideration. The publishing company of Cynthia Dunbar, who was a former SBOE member, just happened to be. And she was also famous for saying that public education was a subtly deceptive tool of perversion. You may have seen her on the ballot in past years. Authors were from Liberty University, not a Mexican-American scholar, history scholar in the bunch. There were over 140 errors, and they described Mexican-Americans as having a mañana attitude and seeking to destroy society. So these SBO public hearings, there were a lot of people who did not like the text. There's supposed to be a chance for the public to state their views. There's a problem with the process, though, because participation depends on the pleasure of the board. And when I went to try to testify, I waited for a couple of hours, and I had to leave to go teach a class because the board was just discussing, well, should we ask for questions afterwards? Well, how should we do this? And they were kind of going on, and even the legislators who had the privilege of speaking first hadn't got to speak by the time I had to leave. So there are issues with participation and fairness. We have continuing issues with Thomas Ratliff leaving, a very political attack on Common Core, which is something it's materials that have been put together by teachers, and it's designed to make it so if students move from one school to another, that they'll have roughly the same information. Charter schools and vouchers, and also the new education savings account, which is kind of another way to get in the idea of vouchers. High stakes testing is the biggest problem, and also now we have a new things coming through the legislature, grading our school. And that means that, guess what? Poor schools will probably get low grades for the most part. Rich schools will probably get A's for the most part. That will be a very surprising result. But it will drive more people out of the public schools, because who wants to go to a school that's getting a D or an F? And that will be based on the performance of the students. Public schools have to accept all students, whether they have disabilities or whatever they have. And so finally, I think one of the biggest things we have to work on is overcoming the effect of No Child Left Behind and the testing mania. This is a little cartoon here of this woman saying, "Am I failing or is it the test?" Next slide. Am I failing or is it the text? And the solutions to these problems: educate yourselves about candidate views and qualifications, and be sure to vote November 8th. So that closes my formal remarks. So if you have any questions.
Okay, now we'll have time for some questions. Douglas Bauer.
First question, does the State Board of Education have any influence on which standardized tests are being used?
It's the TEA that determines that, but the selection of companies that do this, and that's part of the problem, is just that there's kind of a profit motive there. That's determined by TEA, and it's a very murky process. When you have these companies, it's a big contract to get, and then they create the test materials, and it's like a little cottage industry there. I mean, if you recall, when we were young, probably most of you did not have to pass an end of course exam that was administered by the state, you probably just got the grades you got from your courses. You took maybe the SATs or the ACTs to get into college, but now it's a big business.
We have a question from Jim Bryce.
Yes, you've laid out very well the history of the board, and I wonder if there are structural things that might be cured by legislation to make the board more responsive to what's actually going on in education, or needs to go on in education.
Well, there are a lot of things that legislation could do, but we don't really have legislators, for the most part, that think very much about education. We do have some people who are very good champions of education. Certainly Donna Howard has been tireless in working for public education. They did pass a law that said that schools didn't have to use the textbooks, but if you think about the logic of that, most of these schools are going to go with the textbook that is the cheapest and the ones that are recommended, because there are economies of scale that make it so that all getting the same textbook is cheaper and easier for most school districts.
Select a different textbook, the funds to pay for it.
Yes, they have to go through a selection process. So what happens is that in school districts where they're more wealthy school districts, there are teachers who say, I want to use this particular textbook, and they have the ability and the time to be able to do that. But in most schools, they're going with those that are recommended.
We have a question from Glenn Williams.
Yes, what role does the State Board of Education have in determining the sex education curriculum? Do they have a role?
They review that, and it's formulated by people that they pick. The board members recommend people to be on these boards, and some of the people that they recommend don't really have a background in the subject area. So the sex education curriculum, for a while it was recommending abstinence only, and now it recommends abstinence plus. So the emphasis is on abstinence, but they give a little bit of education about preventing STDs and preventing pregnancy.
We have a question from Bonnie Gardner.
Yes, Rebecca, could you tell us a little bit about what did happen with the textbook on Mexican American heritage, how there was some input and then a rethinking of that textbook?
Well, yes, the protest over the textbook was pretty broadly negative, and so they conducted a discussion, and there were 4 members who did not have any problem with the textbook, but the other 11 members had some issues with the textbook and asked it to be brought back for consideration. So it's going to return in November for discussion, and so I think, when people do speak out, they're willing to sort of back up and say, well, let's look at this again. But it's not currently decided.
Please introduce yourself. Please stand up, introduce yourself, and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Martha Mercado, and my question is about suspension in schools and the influence that the State Board of Education can have on it. Namely, at the last AISD board meeting, there was a petition presented to ban the suspension of pre-kindergartners to second graders. And it's definitely an issue that Texas sees a lot of. So how can the State Board of Education influence the suspension rates we see that disproportionately affect African Americans, Latinos, and special education students?
That's a very important issue, and you're absolutely right that suspension is issued in a disproportionate way to African American, Hispanic, and to boys. And it has a negative effect, and there are many other better ways of dealing with problems of discipline in the classroom if there are problems. And the board could educate legislators. The board should be people who are steeped in education, thinking about education, doing their research, doing their homework, and knowing what the latest studies show about issues in education. And this is a big one. We should not be suspending schools and kids from school and kicking them out of school when that's exactly where they need to be. They need to be in school, and we need to have counselors who are available to help work with students who are having issues. And we also need training for teachers to be able to recognize if there is some bias in how they're disciplining students.
We have another question from Jim Bryce.
Yes, to follow up on that, we understand, I've been working in this area of kids that get in trouble in school. Teachers can generally identify those kids that are getting in trouble or are going to be getting in the juvenile or criminal justice system as a result. They know who they are very early on. Here in the Austin area, through an organization I was one of the founders of, the Council on At-Risk Youth, we use those identifications of the students to then take the ones that may be causing those problems and train them in things like handling issues of anger and so forth. And we work in conjunction with the school system doing that. Is there any concern with that and possibility of the state board being able to implement and suggest the implementation of such programs throughout the state?
They absolutely should be implementing that kind of program, because you're right, it's been shown to be very effective. And the board doesn't legislate the spending of money. That's up to the legislature. But the board could, as I say, educate and talk to individual legislators and say, this could make a huge difference in our graduation rates. Teachers don't want to be wasting time dealing with discipline issues, and when you can identify certain students who are having problems, it's usually some kind of family problem, a home problem, psychological problem. It may be drug-related. There are all kinds of things that can cause students to demonstrate these problems. So dealing with that before it becomes an issue, and you don't want to have this school to prison pipeline for these kids. When you discipline them early in school in ways that aren't appropriate, then they end up, either dropping out or rebelling, and we should be doing everything we can to integrate and help these kids.
All right, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
I'm Kenneth Cohen. Rebecca, one of the biggest school districts is that which serves the TDCJ, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, both in the elementary, high school stage, as well as in that for the prisoner. Prisoners are not getting any access at all, hardly. And I ask, can the State Board of Education prevail upon the system so that both books, teachers, and a program actually exist? I'm working with 4 prisoners now. They have no access.
I think that is really important. If we have an education program for people who are in the criminal justice system, who are given that opportunity, recidivism goes down. We don't have those people returning to prison because they have an education, they have an opportunity, they're able to get jobs. It's the best investment we can make. Whenever Texas poor mouths and said, oh, we don't have the money to do this, that's not money spent, that's an investment, and it's one that saves the state money in the long run. It's the same with pre-K education. Everything we can do to help out students, the earlier we can, the better. But even adults who get education in prison have less likelihood of returning to prison, more likelihood of getting jobs when they get out. So yes, the board could educate legislators on these issues. And because of their position, they're somebody that legislators will listen to. probably more than just, average citizens, because the board is supposed to be knowledgeable about education.
We have a question from Luther Elmore.
Yes, that with the board as it's currently constituted, do you see any hope that future textbook approvals will move away from the more partisan perspectives, especially with the outcry against the Hispanic history book? Do you think that there will be a more neutral stance by the board in approving textbooks?
There will be, if we get out the vote and if people vote for candidates who are not so partisan, candidates who know about education, have backgrounds in education. That's not a 100% guarantee, but it really will depend. Right now, the board sort of teeters on issues. It's, kind of 8 to 7 or 7 to 8 on various issues. And there are some people on the board who are very dogmatic in their views and who like to bring political issues to the State Board of Education and to education. So really, if you look at the websites of all the people who are running, you can figure out who is going to listen to teachers, who is going to base decisions on data and research rather than on personal beliefs or political ideologies. So I can say, yeah, I think there's hope.
We have another question from Douglas Bauer.
Yes. Another question about kind of history in the textbooks. Has there been any controversy in the State Board of Education regarding the Civil War and slavery?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. There have been several details that, just for example, in one textbook they described the slave trade as the triangular trade, which was a term that was used to describe that rum and slavery triangle there for trading. But there was also the case where I think it was Bridget Shea's son discovered in his textbook that slaves were described as workers. That just makes them sound like they just thought they better leave Africa and come over here and get a job. So yes, I mean, all of these issues concerning slavery, the history of slavery, have really been not covered in a way that represents what really has gone on in this country. Something that continues to be a problem to this day is just not being able to look at the facts. If you look at the difference in, say, Germany and how they've dealt with their experience with World War II, boy, they've owned up to it. And they, for them, it's a heavy burden that they're willing to shoulder and say, we still have to recover from this. It's one of the reasons they've brought in so many refugees, because they know they created a lot of refugees during World War II. And they accept the burden there. And I think the United States has to accept the burden of slavery, even though it was a long time ago that it was abolished.
We have a question from Tomas Rodriguez.
Thank you for being here and enlightening us. Secondly, an important thing to me years back, the research that I was doing had to do with California schools, particularly Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and a little bit about the New York and definitely Texas. How are those states or districts similar to or different from the Texas board here? Is there a difference? How do they get elected, if they're elected?
I have to say that I don't know the answer to that. You're probably more familiar with their process than I am. I've been educating myself on what goes on in Texas. I was raised in Indiana, so and frankly, I didn't really think about the State Board of Education until, probably about 8 years ago. So I don't know. I think that that it's not as political, and I think there wasn't as much organization that went on. I mean, Texas has a very strong organization of really starting with the Gablers, of getting involved in education and seeing local school boards and then the state's Board of Education as a very important lever, an important key to get across their ideological and religious beliefs. And there are a number of people who advise board members who do not believe in the separation of church and state. So it's a group of people who have that belief. I mean, I don't think it's accurate to say that we don't have separation of church and state, but that's what they believe.
I think we have time for about one more question.
Perfect. My name is Martha Mercado again, and my question kind of is at the core of this whole presentation. It's, through what means can citizens of Texas challenge the qualifications it takes for someone to be eligible to be on the State Board of Education?
They can either challenge them at the ballot box, or they can try to get the legislature to add some requirement, some other requirement. That's the only requirement of being 26-year-old and a citizen and registered to vote. Those are the only requirements that there's ever been. And so it would take some effort to get the legislature to put any requirement in. Yeah. I mean, through a petition, through lobbying your legislators, you can go and visit them. You can send them emails, all of that. I'm not sure. That would be a long haul, considering. I mean, unless there's a shift in the composition of the legislature. I think that trying to make the change at the ballot box is probably going to be a speedier remedy, looking at the qualifications and publicizing those to people.
All right, thank you very much for the presentation today. I think everybody can see how valuable it is. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you all. Thank you.